What is going on, best ball family? We are deep into week 2 of the NFL season, but that doesn't mean best ball has stopped. As a matter of fact, best ball has only begun. And today we're here to take a first look at the 2021 NBA best ball streets. NBA is approaching quickly, and best ball contests have already launched for NBA. I'm sure some of you have already started to fire some entries into those contests. And I think it's time we start talking about some of the basics for NBA best ball. It's a very different, obviously the sport is very different, but the strategy is very different. The scoring is very different. The format is very different from NFL and other future sports like NHL. So just to get a little bit of a primer, let's go over kind of some of the general basics and some things that we need to know, whether it be just like the general scoring, tournament formats, and those types of things, and maybe some basic, strategy, roster construction, things that maybe we started to really, understand on football. We really, had that lockdown pat, and we may not necessarily have that down pat for NBA yet. It's such a new product. It's such a new, best ball sport. I'm sure some people have been playing a little bit already, in the past. I admittedly have not been playing a ton of NBA best ball, but I think that there's a lot that we can glean from what we've been doing for NFL while also adapting to NBA. And try to take down some of these tournaments. And again, this will be mostly tournament focused content. So the first thing is that there's two main sites that we can play NBA best ball on as of right now. That's where the majority of the Spike Week content will be focused, is around Underdog Fantasy, of course, and DraftKings. Those are the two sites with their best ball contests launched right now. Both sites are very similar in terms of drafts. They're both 16-round drafts, so you draft 16 players on both sites. They both have essentially guards, wings, and centers as their three main positions, as well as a flex or a utility position. They're slightly different in that Underdog calls them guards, wings, and bigs, and DraftKings calls them guards, forwards, and centers. The other difference is on Underdog, you will start your starting lineup. Obviously it's automatically calculated because that's what best ball is for you. Every single week, you play a week-long contest, essentially, just like NFL is a week, but basically one game. NBA best ball will be a week, which could be 2 or 3 games for a certain player. It could be 4 games for another player, but it's over the course of a week. And on Underdog, your starting lineup is 2 guards, 2 wings, a big, and one flex, 1 utility player. On DraftKings, it's just slightly different. It's still 2 guards, 2 forwards, a center, but it's 2 flexes, 2 utility positions. So slightly different dynamics between the two sites on the roster, but fairly similar. In terms of scoring, they're actually quite different in terms of how your players will accumulate points on each site. On Underdog, it's quite a bit more basic. For every point the player scores, right? A basketball point. So score a 2-point basket is 2 points. Score a 3-point basket is 3 points. Make a free throw, that's 1 point. A rebound is 1.2 points. An assist is 1.5 points. A turnover is -1 points. And then steals and blocks are actually 3 points. So a big boost to players' scoring can be in steals and blocks. That's it. No bonuses, no points for 3-pointers, no percentages, none of that stuff. That's the scoring on Underdog. For those of you that play NBA DFS, you'll know that is FanDuel scoring. That is what FanDuel uses for their NBA product and how they score their DFS contests. For DraftKings, they are, of course, using the DraftKings DFS basketball NBA scoring, which is a fair bit different. So points are still worth what points are worth, but you do get an extra 0.5 points for a 3-pointer. So players like Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, the 3-point shooters, that's a small boost to those guys. Turnovers are also only negative half of a point, so not negative a full point. So the players like, the high usage players like Russell Westbrook that turn the ball over a lot, slightly less of a concern for them on DraftKings. Rebounds are also worth 1.25, so a little bit of, not a significant boost, but a small boost to the rebounders on DraftKings. And then steals and blocks are only worth 2 points, so not 3. So that's a fairly big difference between the two sites. On DraftKings, you will also get bonuses for double doubles and triple doubles. So you get extra, there's a lot more scoring happening on DraftKings because you're not knocked for turnovers as much. Get a tiny little boost for extra rebounds. You get points for 3-pointers and you get points for double doubles and triple doubles. So the scoring is quite a bit different. But again, it is, if you've played DFS before, it is just FanDuel scoring basically on Underdog and DraftKings scoring, of course, on DraftKings. So those are, the scoring is fairly different, but the roster construction, that how your starting lineup comes together is fairly similar, and they're both 16 round drafts. In terms of tournament format, it's pretty straightforward. As I said, your scoring accumulates over the course of 1 week. There's obviously nuance to that as it pertains to how many games players are playing. That's not a ton that we can do, obviously, about exactly how many games players have scheduled for their team in a given week. But what you will find is over the course of a season, certain players, we understand if we've been following the NBA for the last several years, players are resting, right? Obviously players get injured, but players are not playing back-to-backs. Certain players are not playing back-to-backs. As the season goes on, we have situations like, just veteran rest, not even just back-to-backs, but veteran rest, right? Kawhi Leonard is very famous for this type of situation, but you also might have it with LeBron James, Anthony Davis, etc. Some veteran players may be impacted by the structure of this. So over the course of an entire season, and the fact that you need total points from players in a given week to that's how you're calculating your score. So when you have some things like players that you're expecting to maybe sit out a little bit more than others, that's something that we can factor in to our rankings, to how we're valuing all of these players. Beyond that, though, I do want to get into general just roster construction. So it's quite a bit different, obviously, from a sport like NFL, which I assume most people that are watching this, or most people that are getting into NBA, probably have at least dabbled into NFL best ball. I know that's where I've started and focused most of my best ball time. Most of my best ball interests have been in NFL, but I'm extremely excited about what we can do in these NBA streets, because it is such a fascinating strategic discussion, something that certainly has not been solved. I haven't solved it either, but I think there are some interesting kind of paths that we can take as it pertains to roster construction when it's a little bit simpler than NFL would be, right? NFL has your quarterback, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and flexes. And the nuance around those positions is fairly significant as it pertains to like the player pool, right? Travis Kelce has if you've been playing NFL, the value on Travis Kelce is immense because what he brings you at a position that's a little bit weaker. We have some of that in the NBA, but in general, it's not quite the same, right? There are superstars at just about every position, and we'll get a little bit more into some of those positional things in just a minute. But what you'll find is that in these drafts, you do generally want to be like a little bit more balanced. In an NFL draft, you're not ever drafting 5 or 6 quarterbacks. You're often drafting 2 quarterbacks or 2 tight ends and loading up at these other positions like running back and wide receiver. However, in the NBA, particularly at guard and wing, we don't want to have two guards on our roster, right? We have to make it over the course of an entire season with just these players just these 16 players that we're drafting. And so especially at guard and wing, where we have two starting spots that we have to fill, and those players can count towards utility, we need to be able to get through the ebbs and flows of a season. Even if we have a superstar, right? Even if we draft Giannis, or we draft Luka, or we draft James Harden, we still have to be able to get through the course of a season. And just those two players would not get it done at a position like guard or wing. So you'll see that the optimal strategy is a touch more balanced in terms of across each position than we would see in the NFL. However, at the big position on Underdog, or the center position on DraftKings, it's a little bit more like, the quarterback or tight end position would be in NFL best ball. You have a lot less draftable players at that position, and you only need to start one. The interesting factor of the fact that you only need to start one is A, that allows us to draft less quantity at that position. But B, big men, we also know, typically can score a lot more fantasy points, and the cheaper players can, step into a role, whether they are starting, day one in an NBA season, or maybe they step into a role later in the season. And just by the fact that they're playing center in the NBA, they accumulate more fantasy points than someone that is a wing player that steps into a role. Even guards might score a little bit more fantasy points, but if you are not Russell Westbrook and you step into Russell Westbrook's role, like you're not replacing that. You're not replacing his production. You can't do what Russell Westbrook can do. Often the offense will change. And so the other positions like guard and wing are not quite as replaceable as the big position is, right? We see all the time. I mean, look at guys like Boban that step into maybe he's an outlier, but Boban Marjanovic steps into minutes at the center position, and he's wildly productive. We've seen players like, over the course of several years at center that step in and just produce really strong fantasy results. Even players like Moses Brown last year on the Oklahoma City Thunder, maybe a fringe NBA player, but just by the sheer fact of he's playing center in the NBA for an extended period, extended minutes on a nightly basis, can put up really valuable fantasy scores. So there's a little bit of uniqueness to that big man, that center position on these sites. However, what we also see, a little bit similar to, say, a quarterback or a tight end position in best ball, in fantasy football, is the elite at that position do give you a huge leg up on your competition for a couple of different reasons. Nikola Jokic, Joel Embiid, Karl Anthony Towns, those types of players, the elite centers, are scoring near the top of the league in fantasy points, raw fantasy points. Every single night, they're some of the best options. If you play DFS, they're some of the best spend up options because they're accumulating just so many points, because they are such a huge part of, they're doing more than the Moses Browns are doing. Even though the Moses Brown can be productive, they can't do what an MVP like Nikola Jokic can do, or an MVP candidate like Joel Embiid can do in terms of fantasy production. So there's that interesting kind of back and forth, push-pull on the big man position, where Nikola Jokic does give you a huge leg up on the rest of the centers that you can draft, but there are draftable centers later on that can be productive for fantasy. So that creates different strategies that we can employ at the position. The other interesting thing about the elite big man is that they allow us to then draft less of them. You'll see very, very often, now diving a little bit into this roster construction, you'll see very often all of our opponents are drafting extremely balanced rosters, right? You get 16 positions. So you'll see oftentimes 3 big men. People will draft 3 big men, maybe 4. And then it's a baseline essentially of like 6 guards, 6 wings, and 3 big men. And then you have 1 extra spot to play with. And that's like what you'll see the overwhelming majority of the people drafting. And there's nothing wrong with that. If I were just hopping into a draft and I didn't know what I was doing, by all means, stick to kind of this balanced structure. But in an example like the elite big man, which I think in a second we'll get to some things that we can do with the other positions similarly, is that drafting less, drafting 3, drafting even 2, just 2 of the big men, and banking on that player's score, right? If we draft Nikola Jokic and he gets hurt for an extended period, our team's probably not winning anyway. So we want to draft as if we were right, and Nikola Jokic really is this advantage that we have over our competitors. And so we draft Nikola Jokic, and we're counting on his score every single week in that center position. And then we maybe draft one more because that additional one can play as our flex. Or on DraftKings, maybe you're only drafting 3. 2, I think, is even still possible on a site like DraftKings. However, if there is a valuable big man later in the draft that you want to scoop up as a third, even when you've drafted an elite, I think it can make sense because you can play them in your utility position. And that's the big thing about these contests that I think we can take advantage of, is the sheer fact of our goal is to basically win those flex positions, win those utility positions. Because if you're winning those utility positions, that means we're winning at other positions on our roster, and it allows us to dedicate the resources, typically like our later round picks, at some upside bets that allow us to overcome maybe where we're weaker on our roster with some kind of lottery ticket type guys that we can hope can ascend from a 14th round pick into a 4th round pick next year. Those are the kind of players that we can target by building maybe less of a balanced roster, right? So maybe I do only take on underdog. I take Karl-Anthony Towns and I only take one more center, because even if I'm right about those 2 centers, I can play that they can both be in my lineup every single week if they hit. Then I have 14 other players that I can pick at just these 2 other positions. And so I can, build up a quantity of players at those positions in order to be able to accumulate scores over the course of the season, because I know that I'm slightly weaker, probably slightly weaker at one of those guard or wing positions. And so I need more, more shots on goal. I need more players in my roster, more bullets in my chamber to be able to find the breakout players and find the players and just have scores accumulating every single week, right? We know we're going to have guys injured. We know we're going to have guys resting. And so at my positions where I'm the weakest, I can accumulate enough, again, shots on goal to be able to withstand the course of an NBA season, but also find the players that are providing me scores exceeding their draft value. So that's kind of the general basics to roster construction to me in these NBA best ball tournament drafts. So the last thing I wanted to kind of wrap up with is just a little bit of sort of macro player target level things, maybe some little strategies that we can employ as we're drafting our teams to give us a slight edge, again, from just kind of a first look scenario. And the first one, I kind of talked about it earlier, is this games played idea. We all love LeBron James. We all love even, Kevin Durant. We love Steph Curry. And he maybe wasn't even the best example of this last season, but we know inherently that the older players and oftentimes the players on the best teams in the league are going to sit out more games than the players on the middle tier teams or the younger players. Because these players are just older, they're veterans, they don't need to play every single game, and they don't want to play every single game because they need their body to hold up for the playoffs. And teams like the Lakers and teams like the Brooklyn Nets are in no fear, of missing the playoffs, or so they think. They're not in any danger of missing the playoffs. And so they're going to be planning ahead for the playoffs and not risking injury on older players in meaningless regular season games, particularly against some of the lesser teams or on back-to-backs. So that is something every person, not to get in any sort of micro discussion about players. We all might have different opinions on exactly which players that impacts and how much it impacts them, but that is definitely something to be cognizant of as we're drafting. I don't want an entire team of like kind of all older players on the best teams in the league, because I'm at risk for them having good seasons from an efficiency standpoint and a per game standpoint, but just sitting out enough games or maybe missing games with injury because they're older, or just playing it safe in the regular season. And I end up not having a good best ball team because I didn't take into account the games played aspect of this. The other thing around games played is that there are a handful of players coming into the season injured. The big one that jumps out will be Kawhi Leonard. Like, I haven't seen any firm timetable on Kawhi Leonard. Another player is TJ Warren coming into the season injured. Pascal Siakam coming into the season injured. And there are players like them in the player pool that are drafted fairly high, and they're coming into the season injured. And so I'm certainly not saying to not draft those guys, but they're an important situation to monitor, especially at their current ADPs. If you're going to invest a high draft pick in someone that has a fairly strong likelihood of missing extended time already at the start of the season, I think that's something to make sure that we're very closely monitoring. And then on the flip side of these older players missing time in very established situations, we have upside that we can target in young players, maybe either in uncertain situations or coming into new roles. A player that I most certainly will be discussing, and a team actually that I most certainly will be discussing plenty as we dive deep into NBA best ball season, is like the San Antonio Spurs. They were a pretty friendly fantasy team last year, and now they lost DeMar DeRozan. The usage leader of the team, the veteran kind of rock of the team, DeMar DeRozan. Could the Spurs take a step back as just how good of a real life NBA team they are? Sure, that's certainly possible. But there's a tremendous amount of usage now to go around to players who were already productive and good fantasy assets, like DeJounte Murray, like Derek White, like Keldon Johnson, and other Spurs players that are now stepping into bigger roles, which not only kind of solidifies their projection and their floor, but it also gives them immense upside. If they're the ones that take maybe a higher step forward in the absence of DeMar DeRozan, those new roles with these younger players can be really beneficial. The other thing is just the young players in general. I think what I've seen in the drafts that I've done so far is, especially as the draft wears on, people leaning more heavily on the established names, the established veterans, especially in the later rounds of drafts, because there is uncertainty around some of these young players, or maybe they don't even project to have, a starting role or a huge role right out of the gate. But if we're drafting players later in drafts, in theory, we don't need them in the first week or even the first month of the season. We're looking for them to kind of break out over the course of the season. So in later rounds, not looking to Derrick Rose and not looking to, those types of Jay Crowder, not looking to these veteran established guys who we know what they are, even though they have fairly bankable points that we can count on. They don't necessarily have the potential to turn from a 14th round pick into a 3rd round pick next year. If anything, they might go the opposite direction. And so just some of these young players, and we'll get into more content here on Spike Week very, very shortly around some specific names and specific situations that we can target for those kind of young players that might be able to break out. But just that general premise, I think, is an advantageous one for us to take advantage of. The last thing is correlation and contingent value. So correlation is definitely something we think more of in the other sports. And in fact, typically players on the same team are negatively correlated. But in a situation like the Spurs, where if the team does exceed expectations and you have multiple guys step forward in the absence of DeMar DeRozan, having a couple of shots on them, taking DeJounte Murray and Keldon Johnson on the same team, they can both exceed their value. Or even if they don't necessarily both exceed their value, you can have times where they play the same amount of games in a week and you get the spike weeks, right? No pun intended. You get the spike weeks for both of them together because they're playing their same big weeks together, right? Their same 4 and 5 game weeks together. I don't know if anybody plays 5 games, but they're playing their same 4 game weeks together on the same week. So you create this spike scoring from multiple players on the same week. And then you have potential for this contingent value idea where if someone gets injured, one of their teammates gets injured. We saw this last year with the Indiana Pacers, right? Miles Turner gets hurt. TJ Warren gets hurt. Jeremy Lamb gets hurt. The next thing we know, like multiple Pacers are putting up huge fantasy lines, right? Victor Oladipo was hurt and got traded. There was Malcolm Brogdon, even TJ McConnell, Domantas Sabonis are putting up monster fantasy scores because this situation just broke a certain way that they all got elevated value. And so that can happen with injury. That can happen with player rest, right? Maybe a veteran player on the team is resting later in the season, or it can happen with a trade. Ben Simmons is apparently trying to get traded. Damian Lillard, maybe he gets traded. There's situations like that as well, where they may not appear to have, the absolute best scenario, but if a player gets traded or a player gets injured, we can correlate our bets together, right? If I don't draft Jason Tatum, but I draft Jaylen Brown, and I'm deciding between some players later in the draft, maybe including a Celtic, Marcus Smart, Dennis Schroeder, Peyton Pritchard, Robert Williams, Al Horford, someone like that if Jason Tatum were to miss time, now I have, elevated opportunity for multiple players on the same team. And so we can do little things like that as we build out our portfolio of teams to be able to capitalize on situations that are, we don't know how the season is going to play out, but we can kind of construct our teams in a way that give us the upside to win some of these tournaments and to really benefit late in the season. So that's it. Thank you. I'm Eric Beimfohr. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Beimfohr. Make sure to go to spikeweek.com, join the Discord. It's alive and popping in the Discord with NBA discussion. People are doing drafts. We're talking strategy. And I will have much, much more NBA content to go, as well as NBA rankings coming very, very shortly. But hopefully this was a good kind of 101, NBA Best Ball 101 and primer for the 2021 season. And I will see you guys in the draft lobbies.